Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Rust Belt decline, Sun Belt growth, and the geography of power. The core question is this: who paid the price when factories closed in the Rust Belt and jobs reappeared under cheaper Sun Belt rules? The core competency is to contrast the decline of America's industrial Rust Belt with the rapid growth of the Sun Belt. Who is supposed to pay when a profitable corporation closes a factory, a city loses its tax base, and the jobs reappear hundreds of miles away under cheaper labor rules? That is the right opening question for the Rust Belt and Sun Belt, because regional change in the late 20th century was never a weather report. It was a sequence of choices about capital, transportation, union power, suburban growth, defense contracts, energy, race, and public subsidy. The language of modernization usually hides the losers inside abstraction. A plant relocates. A labor market adjusts. A city transitions. Meanwhile, a steel worker in Youngstown loses a wage scale built through decades of bargaining. A waitress in Detroit serves a neighborhood whose customers are gone, and a school district struggles because the property tax base that financed its classrooms has collapsed. Cities do not decline because history gets bored with them. They decline because firms reprice production, public policy encourages exit, and replacement jobs pay less or land somewhere else. The contrast between Rust Belt decline and Sun Belt growth was a transfer of investment, bargaining power, and political confidence. The industrial Midwest and Northeast had been built through railroads, ports, union labor, immigrant skill, wartime production, and federal infrastructure. The South and Southwest were then built through air conditioning, highways, military bases, aerospace, petrochemicals, low union density, cheap land, retirement migration, and real estate expansion. The market did not act alone. It used roads, contracts, zoning, tax policy, mortgage systems, and labor law written by governments. That makes the civic problem difficult. When a region rises because it offers lower wages, weaker unions, newer suburbs, and lower taxes, is that economic efficiency or public policy choosing one social order over another? The answer decides how millions of families lived inside the bookkeeping. Before large-scale deindustrialization, the old manufacturing belt of the Northeast and Midwest sat near the center of American power. Pittsburgh Steel, Detroit Autos, Akron Rubber, Cleveland Machine Work, Buffalo Grain, and manufacturing and Chicago rail and stockyard networks rested on dense transport lines, union halls, ethnic neighborhoods, and municipal governments financed by industrial property and payrolls. These cities were not accidental. They were built through 19th century rail integration, Great Lakes shipping, immigrant labor, New Deal labor law, wartime contracting, and post-war consumer demand. The post-1945 order gave many industrial workers a recognizable bargain. A union contract could yield hourly wages that supported a mortgage, a car payment, health coverage, and a pension. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 had legitimated collective bargaining, and in major sectors, the United Auto Workers and United Steel Workers could still influence wages, work rules, and grievance procedures. Local governments depended on that ecosystem. Property taxes from plants and neighborhoods funded schools, sanitation, transit, and police. Downtown stores depended on workers spending nearby. Churches, bowling leagues, fraternal halls, and ward organizations all rested on payroll stability. The same period also built the Sun Belt. Federal spending during World War II and the Cold War poured money into Southern California, Texas, Arizona, Florida, and the urban South. Defense plants, naval stations, aircraft manufacturing, missile testing, electronics research, and later space work gave the region a steady inflow of contracts. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 helped create metropolitan sprawl and trucking corridors. Air conditioning made large-scale office, warehouse, and residential growth viable in hot climates. FHA and VA mortgage systems encouraged suburban expansion, often through racially exclusionary development patterns that sorted where wealth accumulated. Right-to-work laws altered the labor calculation. Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 allowed states to prohibit union security agreements. Many southern and western states used that opening to weaken organized labor. For employers comparing Detroit with Texas or Ohio with Georgia, lower union density promised lower labor costs, fewer work stoppages, and more control over production schedules. Add newer factories, cheaper land, weaker environmental restrictions, and local tax incentives, and relocation began to look like a boardroom strategy rather than a desperate last resort. The older industrial order also depended on physical systems that were becoming costly to maintain. Integrated steel mills around the Great Lakes needed coking coal, ore docks, blast furnaces, rail spurs, and river or lake access that tied entire metropolitan districts to one production chain. Auto production in southeastern Michigan relied on stamping plants, parts suppliers, tool and die shops, and enough stable demand to keep national contracts affordable. Once firms faced the combined pressures of the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks, foreign competition, pension obligations, and aging facilities, executives increasingly compared reinvestment in old industrial corridors with greenfield construction in Houston, Arlington, Charlotte, or suburban Atlanta. The numbers favored new sites with fresh roads, lower tax assessments, and fewer inherited obligations. Alternative futures were possible. Federal industrial policy might have tied subsidy to employment retention. Trade adjustment programs could have been broader and more generous. Urban reinvestment might have matched the scale of disinvestment. Instead, policy often favored mobility of capital more than security of place. Deindustrialization did not arrive in a single year. It accumulated through automation, import competition, managerial strategy, energy shocks, and shifting freight systems. In steel, older integrated mills in places like Youngstown and Bethlehem faced competition from newer mini mills using scrap and electric furnaces that melted recycled metal with lower labor demands. In autos, foreign competition from Japanese firms intensified pressure on Detroit after the oil shocks made smaller, fuel-efficient cars more attractive. Corporations responded by trimming labor, modernizing selectively, moving production, or simply abandoning older plants whose cleanup and retooling costs looked too high. The 1977 announcement that Youngstown Sheet and Tube would close the Campbell Works became a symbol because it showed how abruptly a community could be told that decades of labor and civic life now counted for less than a balance sheet. Thousands of workers lost jobs. Small businesses lost customers. Tax collections weakened. Families confronted mortgage debt, retraining pressure, or migration. Similar stories unfolded in Cleveland, Gary, Flint, Buffalo, and sections of Philadelphia and Newark. A factory closure was never one event. It cascaded into school enrollment decline, housing abandonment, insurance stress, and political anger. Management could raise returns by shifting production to lower-cost regions, automating tasks once done by union labor, or sourcing components through national and global supply chains. Governors and mayors in Sunbelt states made the offer sweeter. They assembled industrial parks, road access, tax abatements, utility deals, training subsidies, and anti-union reputations. For a corporation, the ideal site offered low-wage pressure, pliable local government, cheap land, and a workforce with fewer bargaining tools. For workers in the old industrial belt, that same calculus looked like a public decision to discount community survival. The arithmetic became even clearer in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In 1979, Chrysler required federal loan guarantees to avoid collapse, and rescue came with plant closings, concessions, and pressure for leaner production. In steel, imports from Japan, South Korea, and Europe captured market share, while domestic producers delayed modernization. Local officials in the South and West responded with bond packages, industrial revenue financing, and infrastructure promises that shifted public risk onto counties eager for payrolls. Right-to-work states such as Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas sold themselves as places where grievance procedures were shorter, overtime rules were looser, and new non-union plants could open without inheriting decades of bargaining history. The Sunbelt story carried its own friction. Growth in Houston, Dallas, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Southern California depended on water systems, highway spending, airport expansion, military procurement, oil capital, and aggressive suburban development. Texas benefited from energy booms and from petrochemical infrastructure along the Gulf Coast. Southern California combined aerospace, defense, ports, and entertainment. Florida drew retirees, tourism, real estate, and service work. The region sold itself as modern, mobile, and lightly governed, though it relied heavily on federal contracts, federal roads, and federally backed housing finance. Migration followed both push and pull. Workers left declining cities in search of new labor markets, but many migrants also chased lower living costs, non-union plants, construction booms, and warmer suburbs designed for automobile life. Black migration reshaped the South as well, with many African Americans moving back toward southern metropolitan areas after decades of northern movement, drawn by jobs, family networks, and changing racial conditions. Latin American and Asian immigration transformed Sunbelt labor markets and public culture, especially in California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida. Hotels, hospitals, Food processing, construction, warehousing, and domestic labor all expanded through newer migrant labor systems. Regional politics shifted with the census. As population moved south and west, congressional seats and electoral college votes moved too. That shift favored candidates fluent in suburban tax politics, military spending, anti-bureaucratic rhetoric, and a development model built on highways, single-family housing, and commercial sprawl. The old urban union model lost leverage not only because factories closed, but because the nation's political center of gravity moved toward regions with different labor law, different demographics, and different myths about growth. Jimmy Carter's July 1979 address on confidence tried to tell the truth about limits in an age that preferred release. Energy dependence, consumption patterns, and national purpose were connected. Carter was trying to name a society that could not keep promising abundance without discipline. Many listeners heard sincerity. Many others heard accusation. He diagnosed strain at the exact moment voters were turning toward leaders who promised escape from strain. Even the phrase Rust Belt carried politics inside it. It suggested decay, obsolescence, and a past whose machinery had corroded. Sunbelt implied motion, brightness, and a future of new suburbs, defense corridors, and service expansion. The language made one region sound burdensome and the other promising, even when the promising region depended on precarious wages, water stress, racial segregation, and federal subsidy. Jimmy Carter never used the word malaise in his July 15, 1979 speech, yet the address became trapped under that nickname because it sounded unlike the political sales language Americans preferred. Carter said the country faced a crisis of confidence that struck at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. Those words were chosen in a period of gas lines, inflation, and public anger. They were meant to elevate energy policy into a national moral question. That made the source risky from the first sentence. Carter was asking citizens to accept scarcity, conservation, and restraint, while many families already felt punished by price increases and uncertainty. He linked energy consumption, national purpose, and self-government, which was serious and defensible. But a president who asks for sacrifice must usually show unmistakable command over the system, demanding sacrifice. Carter's administrative image was too weak for that exchange. The source is tactical because it reveals a governing style at odds with the emerging mood. Carter tries to make honesty politically useful. He treats crisis as something that should mature the public. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. That phrase may contain truth, but it also risks sounding as though the White House has moved from governing to scolding. A family waiting in a gas line or watching layoffs spread can hear the sentence and ask why sacrifice is being distributed downward rather than structurally. The address stands as the defeated language of one possible response to deindustrialization, energy vulnerability, and institutional strain. Carter's speech says limits are real, and citizenship requires discipline. The politics that followed answered with a different promise. Lower taxes, looser regulations, suburban growth, and a new regional confidence. The speech carried moral force. It failed because morality without a convincing growth path left the field open to rivals who could make expansion sound easier than repair. The contrast between Rust Belt decline and Sun Belt growth remade more than employment maps. It changed tax bases, school systems, labor power, electoral strategy, and the emotional geography of the country. Industrial cities inherited vacant plants, pension stress, environmental cleanup, and neighborhoods carrying the memory of work after the work itself had gone. Sunbelt metros inherited congressional power, development capital, and the confidence that comes from looking like the nation's future, even when that future depended on low-wage labor, speculative housing, and heavy public subsidy hidden behind free market language. The winners of this reordering were not every resident of the South and West, and the losers were not every resident of the old industrial belt. But the broad transfer was real. Bargaining power moved away from heavily unionized manufacturing cores toward regions with weaker unions and more fluid labor markets. Political narratives moved with it. Growth began to sound southern, western, suburban, and entrepreneurial. Decline began to sound northern, urban, unionized, and spent. That framing still distorts judgment. It turns policy into destiny and treats community damage as proof of local failure rather than as a cost absorbed for the sake of mobile capital and national restructuring. If a government builds highways, finances suburbs, funds defense corridors, permits tax competition, and protects corporate exit, it cannot then pretend that regional inequality is merely a natural market verdict. The unresolved question is not whether people should move toward opportunity. They often must. The harder question is whether a democratic society owes anything to the places and workers It has rendered disposable when profitable growth can always be found somewhere else.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.